The enormous, abandoned, Gothic Bledsoe Hall sits on a hill watching over Bledsoe Village. When two London real estate developers hear the dark legend of Lord Bledsoe, they are intrigued. A visit to Bledsoe Hall turns that intrigue into unimaginable horror.
"Isn't Bledsoe Hall just an old dump?" asked Reggie. "It's a beautiful historic manor. In its prime it housed aristocrats," argued his friend Ken. Reggie's Range Rover was just clearing London's outer suburbs and beginning to see the first touches of pastures and farmland in the rolling English countryside. "Its prime," said Reggie, "was the Middle Ages. Has anyone even lived there since the 18th century? Isn't it in ruins by now?" Ken replied, "It was in ruins for decades, but 5 years ago the local historical society got ownership and they've been trying to slowly restore it." "Historical society? Christ! You know it's next to impossible to buy a property once they designate it as a historical site. You never told me that. And that, my friend, is why we're meeting my Uncle Will in Bledsoe Village. He knows everyone there and has lots of pull. If there's a chance of us buying Bledsoe Hall and turning it into a profitable hotel and restaurant, then he'll make it happen." Reggie pursed his lips in thought and nodded. The hedgerow-flanked street wound back and forth until it opened to the main lane in a classic, charming English village. Stone houses and shops lined the street and shared space with cottages with wildflowers and herb gardens. A few pedestrians strolled slowly along the sidewalks as if they had nowhere particular to go and all day to get there. "There, the pub, the Dark Altar, pull up there," Ken instructed. Reggie parked the Range Rover on the side of the street in front of the pub and said, "The Dark Altar? What the hell kind of name is that for a pub?" Ken laughed. "A weird one. It's based on the legend of Lord Bledsoe. Come on, my uncle will tell you the story over a pint." "Or a few pints," Reggie said with a smirk and a wink. They hopped out, crossed the cobblestone sidewalk, and walked into the pub. Their eyes took a few seconds to adjust from the sunny day to the darker interior. "Wow," Reggie said softly. The pub might as well have been a throwback to the Gothic period. Black wood panels formed the walls, booths of ornate carved wood with pointy Gothic flourishes lined the sides of the pub. A central square bar constructed of dramatic red and white marble with ebony columns at each corner that reached up to the blood-crimson copper ceiling stood in the middle of the pub. Behind the bar, in the space between it and the back wall, rose an altar of ebony wood. Its sides were carved with intricate spirals and whorls, and the heads of small demons and angels. The windows were stained glass and depicted little village scenes that looked medieval. "Yeah," Ken answered. "Takes some getting used to. Pub's been here since the 1300s. Lord Bledsoe's a real legend around here. Look, there's Uncle Will. I'll introduce you." A thin man with a friendly face and shaggy hair sat in one of the high-back booths. He waved the two Londoners over. Will stood up and shook Ken's hand while patting him on the back. "My nephew. Great to see you." "Same, Uncle Will. This is my friend Reggie I told you about." Will smiled and shook Reggie's hand. "A pleasure, Reggie. Welcome to Bledsoe Village and the rather unique Dark Altar pub." Reggie chuckled and said, "Unique for sure. I've never seen anything like it. Something to do with the legend of Lord Bledsoe?" Will gestured at the booth. "Please sit. Pints on me. I'll tell you the story and then I'll take you out to Bledsoe Hall to see it in person." He walked to the bar, ordered 3 pints, and returned. "Cheers, mate," Reggie said. "Yeah, thanks, Uncle Will," echoed Ken. "No worries, guys. By the way, this is a local brew that the proprietor makes himself. It's an India Pale Ale." Will raised his glass, then Reggie and Ken did the same. They touched glasses, then each took a sip. Reggie's, his eyes opened wide. He swallowed, then took another big sip. "Wow, that's really good," he said. "I mean, really excellent. Impressive." "The pride of Bledsoe Village," Will said with a wink. "Obviously, the village is named after Lord and Lady Bledsoe." The pub was only half full at this time of the afternoon. The other patrons were mostly old men minding their business but offering the occasional furtive glance at Reggie and Will, the outsiders. "Yeah, what's his story then? Lord Bledsoe?" Reggie asked. Will nodded, then began his tale. Lord Nigel Bledsoe, born at Bledsoe Hall in 1522 and lived there until his death in 1748. Wait, Reggie said, looking up and counting in his head. You sure those dates are right? He lived to 226. Ken and Will looked at each other and chuckled. That's how the story goes, Will said. Of course it's preposterous on the face of it. No one lives that long, but the odd thing's that the village chronicles and many contemporary writings mention Lord Bledsoe as being quite alive throughout those years. They wrote about him in the 1500s, they wrote about him in the 1600s, and they wrote about him all the way until his funeral in 1748 was recorded in the local church records. This historical evidence is there. My personal theory is that he was confused with his son and grandson or something like that. But that's not the strangest part of the tale. Reggie, now hooked, leaned forward. Pint in hand, he tensed his forehead with concentration and looked into Will's eyes as the man spoke. Will's voice soothed them with its slow rhythm and gentle accent. Well, his wife, Lady Bledsoe, was sickly, thin and pale, very weak and frail. She seldom appeared in public. When she did, the villagers mostly pitied her. Her life of luxury up at the manor could not have been too satisfying if she was always ill. When she eventually died, Lord Bledsoe held a sombre but lavish funeral for her and invited the entire village. Reggie nodded and gazed up at the copper ceiling. He seemed to be trying to imagine what the funeral must have looked like. How many people lived in the village then, and how many now? He asked. As of today, the population of Bledsoe village is around 5,000. It's grown. In Lord Bledsoe's day, around the time of Lady Bledsoe's funeral, it would have been a little over 2,000, which was rather populous for a village of the time. Never a major city or anything like that, though. Reggie nodded, and Will continued his story. Well, after the funeral, young women and girls began to disappear from the village. A farmer's daughter here, a publican's niece there. Because life was harder then, most villagers attributed it to the normal troubles of life or wild animals or elopements or illness. It was not until a missing girl of about 14 returned to the village, mutilated but still alive, that those assumptions began to change. Before she died a few days later, she told a most strange tale of being abducted and taken to Bledsoe Hall, where Lord Bledsoe himself had done all sorts of terrible things to her. Reggie was mesmerized, and even Ken, who had heard the story before, seemed equally bewitched by the bizarre and unsettling tale. They looked like young boys listening to a parent telling them a bedtime ghost story. The villagers attributed the girl's tales to delusion from exposure to the elements, but the village magistrate and constable did pay Lord Bledsoe a visit just in case. Finding nothing untoward and no evidence of any sort of evil happening at Bledsoe Hall, they apologized to the Lord for the intrusion, and life continued. They didn't believe her. What? But she was mutilated, Reggie protested. In the late Middle Ages and early modern period, Will explained, life here was brutal, and a young girl lost in the wilderness would have been expected to have been attacked by animals. In any case, more young women and girls kept disappearing. Finally, one of Lord Bledsoe's servants, a chambermaid apparently overcome with guilt, fled into the village and confessed to the magistrate that Lord Bledsoe indeed had been kidnapping the girls, abusing them in the most horrible of ways, and offering their blood to some strange god he worshipped. She begged them to do something. Reggie finished his pint. Usually he would have followed that up immediately with a second round, but so entranced was he in the tale that he just placed the empty glass down as if he did not even notice the lack of the ale that he so loved. And did they believe the servant? He asked with a high-pitched, expectant voice. They did. Even though women were not considered reliable sources at that time, still, knowing her fate should she be lying about her master, they decided to take her seriously. The constable gathered a group of villagers to accompany him, all men at first, but once the rumours got out, the group was a mob composed of all sorts of villagers, men, women and children. They stormed up to Bledsoe Hall. Bursting in, they found another peasant's daughter tied up in a room. This was evidence enough. They searched for Bledsoe and found him worshipping at some strange dark altar. Do you see that altar in the back of this very pub? That's a replica, supposedly. Reggie and Ken looked again behind the bar to see the strange ebony altar. Its presence took on a new, darker significance. Here is where the records become fuzzy. Some sources say the villagers captured Bledsoe and tore him apart on the spot. Others, that he underwent a trial and was found guilty of all sorts of terrible offences and hanged or burned. Yet other sources say that he escaped. Whatever really happened, he did eventually die, and the disturbing legend of Bledsoe Hall continues to this day. Now, gentlemen, shall we have a drive up to the manor and take a look? Despite the dark history, it's a splendid mansion, and Ken's told me of your plans to buy it and use it as a hotel and restaurant. Frankly, the villagers here would rather see it turned into something modern and useful and pleasant instead of an old, rotting reminder of this place's evil history. Come. They left the pub and climbed into Reggie's Range Rover. A short drive up a hill later, Bledsoe Manor revealed herself through the trees, a magnificent three-storied sprawling manor in the Gothic architectural style but darkened with age, wear and dirt. She loomed like an ancient reminder of what might have really happened within her secret walls. Wow, just wow, declared Reggie. I've seen photos, but in person it's both magnificent and terrifying. Yeah, it's imposing, the size of it, Ken agreed. Reggie pulled up to the front and parked. The three men got out of the Range Rover and walked to the front door, a double door of metal that rose at least 15 feet high, as if the builder had intended the entrance and exit of giants or monsters. Will had the massive skeleton key from another era, so he unlocked the door. Pausing just a moment, they opened the door and stepped inside. Immediately struck by the odour of stale must and long history, they found themselves in a spacious foyer. Ahead was the grand staircase, a double swirling helix that led to the upper floors. Above them, a chandelier larger than Reggie's Range Rover hung, a chandelier meant for real candles and not electricity. At each sconce, the waxy, melted remnants of a burning candle rested, dark and cold, any mirth or liveliness once shown now dead and buried. Will took Reggie and Ken on a tour of the stupendous mansion with its several large kitchens, its halls of luxurious bedrooms, its libraries and studies and parlours, its grand ballroom, its staircases and servants' quarters, and countless other rooms and passages. They tried to imagine the grandiosity and extravagance when once full of the Bledsoes and all their servants and guests and parties and balls and meetings and cooks and dinners. It must have been quite an operation to merely keep it running. "I believe you'll appreciate the wine cellar," Will said. "All the wine's still there untouched. If you do buy the manor, then all that wine is yours. I imagine it's invaluable both in price and in enjoyment. Are you a wine drinker, Reggie?" "Oh, hell yes," he said with a greedy smile. They descended a staircase from the kitchen. So dark was the cellar that Will's tactical flashlight, from his time in the military, bright as it was, could barely show them the far wall. In the space between, racks and rows of bottles and even entire casks and barrels created a sort of city of wine. "Damn," marvelled Reggie. "Lord Bledsoe loved his red," said Will. "So if you do end up buying the property—" Just then, a creak came from the depths of the cellar, as if someone had walked onto an old wooden floorboard. Reggie looked in the direction of the sound. Will smiled and said, "You'll drive yourself crazy if you let every sound in such an old large house disturb you. It creaks and groans all the time. Just natural expansion and contraction depending on the weather, and it's becoming a bit cool now. As to the estate agency handling—" Another creak came, but this time accompanied by the distinct sound of human footsteps from somewhere far off among the bottles. Will stopped talking and shone his flashlight towards the sound. "Strange," he muttered, then called out, "Hello, I say, is someone there? Just show yourself, please. We're only looking round the house. You're not in trouble." He whispered to Ken and Reggie, possibly a homeless person or teenagers having fun. There were several moments of silence, then a raspy wheeze hissed through the cellar, and then a distinct human cough. The three men stood unmoving, utterly unnerved. "Hello!" Reggie called out in a voice that was slightly shaking. The footsteps grew louder and the raspy cough repeated itself. Then, in the flashlight's distant beam, the figure of a man appeared. Dark, shadowy, tall and wraith-thin, he seemed to be struggling to walk as he approached. "Sir? Are you quite all right?" Will asked. "Who are you, please?" The figure said nothing but continued walking towards them until the flashlight just made out a gaunt, pale face with black eyes in deeply sunken sockets. The man's arms were too long and thin, his fingers too spindly and tapered. "What the hell?" muttered Ken. "He looks like he's half starved. We need to call the police. He might be in trouble." The emaciated, pallid man extended his hands towards the three men, and they instinctively backed up a few paces until they heard a hissing from behind them like a den of vipers. Wheeling around on their heels, they were confronted with a crowd of young women, all of them gaunt and pale like the man. Soon, they were surrounded. The man finally spoke. "It has been so long since we have had visitors, so long." "Who the hell are you?" Will shouted with fear and aggression in his voice. And said, "Why, sir, I am Lord Bledsoe, and this is my home. Why are you here?" "Lord Bledsoe? What? He's been dead for over 200 years, cried Reggie. "Have I?" "Not quite," the man rasped. "I and my brides have been here resting, awaiting visitors. It has been so long, he has been so parched." "He?" Ken asked frantically. "Lord Asmodeus, granter of eternal life, generous bestower of immortality in return for offerings of blood." Reggie, Ken and Will formed a defensive circle back to back and held their fists up. Still, Lord Bledsoe and the crowd of pale girls staggered towards them, closer and closer. The girls began to whine, a chorus of lustful whimpering. "Feed my brides, engorge yourselves on their blood, and the sacrifice will be most pleasing to Lord Asmodeus." The creatures reached the three men and, despite their fighting back, took them in cold vice grips effortlessly. Knocking them to the ground, the ghouls piled on top of them and began to eagerly tear into their flesh with long, yellow teeth. Reggie, Ken and Will shrieked and thrashed, but they were powerless. Lord Bledsoe and his brides ate their flesh and drank their blood. Below the hill back in Bledsoe village, life continued on in its slow pace. It was only a week or so later than anyone even noticed that Will had not been seen.